Introduce to you Dorian Borbonus, the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman National Endowment for the Humanities Rome Prize Fellow in Ancient Studies. Dorian is a scholar of ancient Greek and Roman history who is trained in Mediterranean archaeology. He earned his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania, and when not with us at the Academy, he is an assistant professor of history at the University of Dayton in Ohio, where he has taught since 2006. In his research, Dorian combines methodologies from both history and archaeology to offer new insights into his particular area of study, namely the relationship between funerary practices, power, and identity in Republican and Imperial Rome. His scholarship on these topics has received several prestigious awards, including fellowships from the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin, the University of Pennsylvania, and the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Dorian's first book, Columbarium, Tombs and Collective Identity in Augustan Rome, published in 2014 by Cambridge University Press. No, I broke it. Mined the material remains of this non-elite underground burial type to bring to life the conditions that shaped not only funerary culture, but also social hierarchy in the early Roman Empire. His insights into this previously neglected topic have been praised by his peers as, quote, vivid, enlightening, and providing a great sense of place, end quote, given this the less read Italian contributions on the history of non-elite burial tombs. While at the Academy, Dorian is at work on his second book, The Tombs of Rome, Burial and History in the Center of Power. As many of you will recall from our first walk together this fall, when he enlightened us about the cultural significance of Augustus's mausoleum, Dorian in this particular project seeks to create the first historical narrative of the imperial capital that is based primarily on funerary culture. His work stems from a central premise, that changes in funerary culture, which can be observed through material remains, mirror broader developments in social structure and cultural norms. To understand this relationship in all of its complexity, Dorian has cast nets of two sizes, as I see it, one small and one large. On the one hand, he has given himself the more or less manageable task of focusing his study on Rome, the center of the empire, which will reveal not only the relationship between burial practices of the imperial capital, but also the connection of a capital city to its outerlying territories. On the other hand, Dorian is looking at a broad spectrum of time, roughly 4 centuries, which will allow him to chart the ebb and flow of burial practices for indications of the evolutions of ways of life in the Roman world at its most vibrant moment in history. What Dorian's research reveals with such clarity is not only how the realm of the dead can reflect with remarkable precision the trends of the living in antiquity, but also how integrating questions, scopes, and methodologies of different scales and different disciplines can produce new, far more nuanced ways of understanding the past, its material culture, and the societies that produced it. Thus, scholars of ancient Rome as well as later eras will have much to learn from Dorian's forthcoming book. Please join me in welcoming Dorian Borbonus, who tonight will share with us his thoughts in his lecture titled Towards a Funerary Landscape of Imperial Rome. Dorian.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that summary of my shop talk, basically, because that's more or less exactly what I'm going to talk about. You mentioned that I'm working on my second book, and I hope it's going to be a book soon, because right now the task of tackling an entire city as complex as Rome is harder than you might think, actually. That's why maybe the most important word in the title of my lecture today is towards. What I basically want to do, my decision for tonight, I guess, is that the decision that I had for tonight is that I don't want to talk about previous work so much, and that was already summarized for you anyway, but I kind of present a work in progress, I guess. I very much will talk about what I want to do and what I think about that, and what challenges I expect, and what thoughts I have, even though some of them might be a little crazy, rather than things I have already done. So it's a little bit tentative. And it's also a little bit precarious to talk about things that I haven't done yet, but I also think of it as sort of as an exciting time period where things take shape, and that's why I specifically out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about burial in general first, quite disconnected from history or Roman history in particular, because I think most of us probably don't think about it on a daily basis, I guess, and that's probably a good thing. But then I'm going to take you a little bit through some of the beginnings of the scholarship on Roman tombs, which I find particularly interesting, before I offer some thoughts about my own project and where I see it going this year. Yes. So when we actually think about a city, right, which is what we see here, an image from 19th century Rome, we don't typically think about cemeteries. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. And this may actually be sort of a sign of our times in a global, mobile community or society. The kind of link to the land that I think that cemeteries provide seem increasingly irrelevant. And actually recent burial trends take that into account, that are not linked to a specific place anymore, or the latest trend that I've witnessed both in Europe and the United States is natural burial, where the place is still there but sort of becomes less the focus of the burial. Even so, I think cemeteries do play or do form part of our kind of daily urban experience in cities. Whether we live in a city or we visit a city, cemeteries are the places we pass, the places that we might kind of use for reflection or even commemoration, or things that we might even visit in other cities. I heard that some of you actually had just had a visit of the cemetery that I was going to begin with. Here we see an image of one of the memorable cemeteries of Rome, the Cimitero Cattolico, which some of you went to, and I missed that visit, but I'll go in the next couple of weeks, I think, where, as many of you know, of course, many famous intellectuals, artists, politicians are buried over the past 300 years. Actually, it marks its 300th anniversary this year and has a special connection to the American Academy. So the cemetery has sort of a huge concentration of talent. But what's also striking about it, I think, is the diversity of people from different nations, different religions, tombstones in different languages. And that I find an interesting starting point, because a cemetery like this is a real useful reflection on the character of a city, I think. What it says to me is, or what it reflects to me, is the draw, the pull of a city like Rome over centuries on certain kinds of people that came to be buried there. So it's a useful reflection, I think, of a city. But a cemetery doesn't mean the same to everybody. Of course, it differs from visitor to visitor, from observer to observer. In fact, cemeteries might, or one group of people that a cemetery might have a special significance to are immigrants. Just to illustrate that point, I want to show you a site that those of you from New York might be familiar with. Here we have a cemetery from Brooklyn, and what we're looking at here is a burial plot of a Jewish Landsmannschaft. So these Landsmannschaften were associations, essentially, of Jews from Eastern European Shtetls, cities, and basically sort of expats that got buried together. These associations didn't only bury their members, they also were social clubs, if you will. They had sort of social events, but also provided various services, among which was burial. And just visually, you can see that the burial plot is kind of separated with a gate and a fence, right? So it articulates some sort of unity right there through its setup. But interestingly, sadly actually, but also interestingly, these Landsmannschaften are struggling to maintain the cemeteries today because their memberships are dwindling. So clearly, the significance of a burial plot like that is changing over time. Right? To first generation immigrants, it was a very important thing to be buried together and also have all these other benefits of a Landsmannschaft. But third, fourth generation immigrants in the 21st century, it has lost some of that significance, right? So the cemetery changes its significance depending on who you talk to, and this also changes over time. So this is kind of basically my starting point of why, of how I want to now treat Roman tombs. Before we get to the concrete tombs, as I said before, I want to kind of start to think about the scholarship on them as well, and I want to start at the very beginning. Because in Rome, if you work on tombs, you have to start at the very beginning, because the discovery of tombs is in a way bound to the beginnings of archaeology, even as a discipline. It was the first discoveries of tombs in the 17th, even 16th century. That was one of the things that really led to more systematic exploration. Some of these early publications from those times look like this. On the left, I'll show you an image by Piero Ligorio, 1553, from a manuscript called Libro delle Antichità di Roma. One volume of which, volume 49, is entitled Luoghi di sepoltura della famiglia romana e degli uomini illustri. So 113 folio depictions like this of famous Roman tombs. If you have not recognized it by now, this is of course a tomb we visited, the mausoleum of Augustus, with some commentary there on top. And it's kind of a spectacular depiction, and the whole monumentality. It's also, interestingly, a reconstruction. This is not what the tomb looks like, right? The obelisks that we talked about are in front of it. The statue that we talked about is on top. So Piero Ligorio, from the very outset, is not just an antiquarian who depicts things for sort of the interest of the monumentality of the monuments that are still around, but actually tries to reconstruct things. And this kind of creates a tradition. 100 years later, on the right, we are actually right behind the American Academy in the Villa Corsini, which you see in the back, which is now gone, but was at the beginning of the park of the Villa Doria Pamphili, where this cemetery was excavated, and Pietro Santi Bartoli depicted kind of like a plan and also reconstructions of these monuments. So there's the same kind of style, maybe also of emphasizing the monumentality of things. And it sort of continues like this as new discoveries came out. If we go into the 18th century, on the left, we see a Pier Leone Ghezzi's depiction of the Columbarium of Livia. This one is right on the Via Appia. It's now destroyed, so images like this is the only thing we've got. And you see that the monumentality gets even bigger and maybe reaches a climax, a maximum when we reach Piranesi, who, in his depiction of a relatively normal tomb along the Via Appia, depicts the human being so small that they would fit in one of the tiny burial niches, right? So the monumentality is really exaggerated here. There's also another kind of tradition, namely emphasizing uomini illustri, important men, important people, important families, that goes back all the way to Piero Ligorio and goes through these publications and into the 19th century, when we have another excavation that I want to show you here from the Esquiline. Here we have a sort of more sober archaeological documentation, a plan, various cross-sections. The excavations don't seem to be very stratigraphical, but anyway, there's actually even more tombs that were discovered later, so it's a huge cemetery. But the excavator, Edoardo Brizio, was really only interested in one of these tombs, namely this was a tomb not of an illustrious man, but of an illustrious family. It was the tomb of the slaves and freed slaves of the aristocratic gens Statilia, one of the great families of first century Rome. That's where he spent his entire time on it. He really just uses the cemetery to reconstruct the history of that great family, going so far as to even say at some point inscriptions from this tomb that don't tell us anything about the family have absolutely no historical value. Right? So here's a tradition that sort of plays, it's remarkably consistent and long-living focus on illustrious families. Fortunately, nowadays, this is kind of being challenged and complemented by other research, but it's still maybe something that characterizes the ancient scholarship today. This is not to say that there were not new trends. I'll give you one last example of an early excavation, the one where actually my title slide came from Gian Pietro Campana, who discovered two tombs near the Via Appia. I give you one page of his publication right there, where he talks about, I have to stay near the microphone, I guess, where he talks about grande azione di prischi eroi, so he still talks about heroes, right? But then he makes an interesting comment that was very influential and very new at this time, and so I want to kind of quote it maybe in full. He says right here, però l'esuberanza, no, I can't read it, of course. I'm going to just do this from here. L'esuberanio incremento della romana popolazione che progrediva di pari d'attività della potenza di quella repubblicana, a poco persuasero che scarsa è la superficie del terreno per costituirvi novelli sepolcri. So he's talking about space getting scarce in the city, basically, right? And there was not enough space to even build new tombs. And later on, goes on to say that out of this, nacque una particolare foggia di sepolcro edificio capace di accogliere nel più economico spazio il maggiore numero di cadaveri. So out of this grew a new type of funerary monument that was capable to accommodate the most bodies, the most burials in the most economical space. And if you look at the tomb that he excavated, you can see why he might say that. There's a lot of burials there, neatly arranged. Looks very economical to us, right? But the same was true 100 years earlier, right? And nobody talked about economical burial space there. So what's going on here? Well, I think it has something to do that we're in 1840 here. The city of Rome is starting to grow again. Maybe this was just an offhanded comment, but this turned out to be the most influential interpretation of this type of tomb called the Columbarium. And especially as the city of Rome grew, once it became a capital of Italy after 1861, and kind of had its own population explosion, that was a very compelling image, right? And it still actually characterizes publications on this type of tomb in the 21st century. Once this idea is out there and becomes popular, it's repeated over and over and over again. I'm not saying that this idea is wrong, right? Or that we have to dismiss it or something like this, but I think it's also important to kind of revisit these kinds of interpretations and questions that people have asked, and maybe kind of see if we can complement them maybe with new ones. So how do we do this? Typically in this case, classical archaeologists would look at texts. So let's do that real brief. Here's a very important text by Marcus Terentius Varro from the 1st century, who is not talking about tombs at all here, but it's a very influential passage for the interpretation of Roman tombs. He really actually gives etymological explanations of words here. In this case, the word is meniminice, and to remember, right, which he gives various explanations for, and at some point he says, sic monumenta qua in sepulchris. So also, like to remember, right, so also the memorials that are on tombs, and outright along streets, so that they may admonish, admonian, the praeteriundis, this is the most important word, the passerby, that they, the people who were buried, I guess, were, and he is. This passage is very important because it effectively gives us, in an ancient passage, an audience for Roman tombs. Who was supposed to look at them? The passerby. And the reason why this passage was popular and influential with archaeologists, I think, is because it matches what Roman tombs look like so well. Here's a famous example, well, this one first, on the Esquiline. Many of you will be familiar with it. A tomb that's full of sculpture, reliefs, inscriptions, and other commemorative content, and there are two streets running right by it. The gate wasn't there really when the tomb was built, but there's a street passing here, and there's a street passing on the back, and they meet up here. So maximum public effect, it seems like. Matching this image here rather well. Things didn't stay the same, though. Roman tombs developed over time, and this one is sort of a very late Republican tomb, maybe. If you fast forward 100 years to the late 1st century CE, tombs looked more like this. I tried to find an image of two tombs that look exactly the same, because that's the typical situation. From the outside, they don't seem to be much in competition with each other. They have very similar facades. They're not even on the street anymore. The Via Ostiensis kind of runs back here somewhere, and this is kind of like a street that runs off the main street, right? So the public effect didn't stay the same, which has given rise to yet another interpretation, namely that the switch from republican system, which we have up here, to an imperial society, where you have an emperor obviously at the head of the government, led also to a mental change, that people sort of withdrew from the public sphere into something more private, which is another one of these notions that I don't think is wrong, but could probably be qualified. We can probably come up with a more subtle reading as well, or maybe just not one that applies to all Roman tombs, but we can differentiate it. So that's why I want to use sources in a different way. Varro, for example, doesn't even talk about tombs, really, right? That's not his subject. And the sources that talk about the decline of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire are highly moralistic, so they have an agenda that we might take too literally if we imply them directly. I think the place of written sources is very important, actually, in classical archaeology. It's one of its major advantages, but I think we should use it more to gain some sort of literacy, maybe. An intuition of ancient concerns, of social benchmarks, assumptions, anxieties, hopes, aspirations, things like this. And we know that burial was an important social and also emotional event, and it was also very much bound up with everyday lives. Death was an everyday occurrence, and something that you encountered in your own family or household or something like this, or out in the streets. So it is something that is really connected to everyday urban life. Potential, I think, to learn about history from funerary customs and from material culture that is associated with it. And my project kind of seeks to use that potential. In Rome, actually, you have so many tombs that you have an almost unbroken sequence of tombs from the earliest burials until sort of contemporary cemeteries that we looked at the beginning. So you can, in theory, construct a whole timeline, if you could date every tomb very well, which you can't, but in theory, you could construct a whole timeline that would represent the entire history of the city. No one has really done that for a good reason, I think. People have done it actually for other cities, like, I'll show you two recent publications. Here's a book about the entire cemeteries of Ostia. And just last year, I think, a book came out about the Tombs of Pompeii. These two books treat entire cities, every single tomb monument, because it's possible, right? Because I think each of them have about 110, 120 tombs in them or something like this, right? That's doable, I think. Even so, you get lost in a lot of detail in these books that typically have a long catalog at the end where a lot of information is listed. I'm not saying that this is not important, but I am saying that this would be impossible for Rome, right? It's not doable, nor is it even desirable, because you would get lost in the details so much more, right? So the challenge kind of is to, I think, grasp the funerary landscape without any kind of pretension that this is going to be complete, right? Try to grasp the major developments without creating a catalog. That's not going to be possible in this case. It's a very opportune time to do so, by the way, because there is lots of trends to really conceive of the city as more a whole. So the archaeologists among you will be familiar with the dictionary projects like the Lexicon Topographicum that has characterized the last 2 decades maybe. That is a very traditional undertaking, listing entries on all the monuments, but actually covers the whole city and even the whole surroundings of the city. And there's new projects even. The Carta Archeologica di Roma puts out volumes now that list all the remains that were ever found that we have archival records for in the entire city. There's when we get to tombs, a documentation project on the Via Appia where they document a whole mile of tombs with sort of the latest digital techniques and GIS maps and things like this. Our advisor from the German Archaeological Institute here has a kind of project that uses digital methods to record tombs as well. So there's new data, novel types of data coming out, which of course offers great opportunities for new knowledge, but also I think creates a necessity to kind of grow our conceptual frame along with it. just get sort of new information, but it's a very good time, I think, to think of the tombs of the city as a whole. So, if we kind of visualize our landscape here, I like this image because it gives us a landscape with tombs in them, but also it's an urban landscape, it's a city. My goal this year is sort of a holistic treatment. I've done this, as Lindsay said before, with a particular type of tomb before, with a Columbaria, but I think it should be possible to view the city through its tombs on an urban scale. And my hope is that it will get us as close to a funerary landscape as we can hope to get. And what I mean with funerary landscape is sort of an environment in which tombs, like in this image, might still take center stage, right? They're still in the middle of the image here. But they're, first of all, visible in their entirety. We're not looking at sort of an inscription or just one piece of evidence, but we're looking at an entire monument in all its complexity, and integrated, actually, also into a landscape, both into a topography of surrounding features. In this image, you see streets, you see a wall, you see gates, plants, right? But also a landscape that's inhabited by people, which actually use the landscape and experience it. So that's why this image kind of spoke to me for today's topic. Holistic reconstructions, of course, are also challenges because you deal with so much information, right? So since I'm not limiting myself in terms of space, at least as far as the city goes, right? And the time frame is also fairly large. What I'm going to try to do for the rest of my time is take you through a couple of aspects. I think you have to look for certain things if you're not going to be complete about this. I'm going to do 4 things, real brief. I'm going to look at typology, commemoration, something that's important with tombs, topography, and ritual. I'm going to just do a quick overview of those 4 things for you. The first one that I mentioned, typology, is maybe the most conventional archaeological method. Right? It also has a bad reputation because sometimes it sort of takes on its life of its own and people just do typology without drawing conclusions from them. But if you use it as a technique, I think it can be used in very analytical ways. If you look at sort of the spectrum of Roman tombs, here's just a random kind of slide. This could be easily extended. You can see that there's a lot of different types of Roman tombs. We have seen many of them already, right? Many of you will have passed by the Pyramide or been in the catacomb. We have been here in Isola Sacra where we have these so-called house tombs. Those of you who went down the Via Appia saw this tumulus right there. And there are several other ones. And I'm just showing you these to show you sort of what the spectrum is. And also to show that really you can pretty much distinguish between the different types on formal grounds, suggesting that, you know, for a reason, namely that there was some sort of choice that somebody made at some point. I'm not saying it was necessarily a free or conscious choice. It might just have been somebody who adhered to a certain established pattern that existed already. But I would think that the type of a tomb means something. Of course, that something is not easy to reconstruct in individual cases, but if you take a lot of them together, I think at least what you can say is, you know, do they all look the same? Is there a lot of diversity? And that might mean something more concrete that we can actually discover. In fact, there is a development. Right, that's what I always try to get to. If you kind of arrange some of these types here, not all of them over time, I constructed a very simple timeline for you. Right? This is more or less my time frame, from 200 BCE to about 200 CE. And this is more or less what you see. The earliest remains that we have in this period are aristocratic tombs. This one is the most famous, the tomb of the Scipios, but there's others. We don't really know at this early time how non-aristocrats were buried, not in a lot of detail anyway. So this would, to me, suggest some sort of systematic diversity. Different classes of people get buried differently. But as you move through time, a lot of new types pop up. Tumuli, here we have the Columbarium, and other types of tombs. Some of them are actually inspired from the outside. There's some talk about whether the tumulus might be inspired by Etruscan or even Phrygian tumuli. The Columbarium, I have argued, comes from the Eastern Mediterranean. So a lot more unsystematic diversity. Lots of different people now built and are buried in these tombs, not just aristocrats. And the inspirations come from the outside. If you move on another 100 years or so towards the end of this timeline, you see these tombs that we saw, of the type that we saw in Isola Sacra as a group. These ones are actually from Rome, from a cemetery underneath the Cathedral of St. Peter. And as I said before, here you find more homogeneity. The tombs look very similar to each other. So what does this development suggest? I'm not entirely sure yet, but I would say that at the beginning you have your typical Mediterranean regional capital with a local aristocracy. As the Roman Empire grows, there's contact with other building traditions that influence or inspire new types. And over time, kind of a cultural vision emerges, right? This is a recognizably Roman tomb, right? It doesn't exist somewhere else and is then imported here. This is something that develops at Rome and is then actually copied in other places like Isola Sacra, Ostia, Pozzuoli, and other places in Italy, right? So this is what this narrative kind of broadly suggests to me. We can also view this in experiential terms. That's something that would also be interesting or important in terms of a landscape. So here are two views of streets with tombs that lead into cities. Here's an impression of sort of the jiggly bike ride that we took on the Via Appia. And you see different types right next to each other. And if you paid attention during that bike ride, you saw lots of different types of tombs all along the street. So this is a street that was used for hundreds of years for burial, and it suggests or it kind of communicates the whole history of the city through its tomb monuments, at least as a visual impression. It's very different if you look at Isola Sacra. Not so easy to view from this picture, but if you remember our visit, there you have a completely homogeneous landscape or street or whatever. So the people who passed this cemetery, probably twice a day on their way to work and back, saw kind of a very, very defined vision of what a burial looks like. Right? In fact, to put it another way, if you wanted to build a pyramid, you could easily do so here. It wouldn't really kind of stick out that much. If you did so in this cemetery, it would stick out very much. For which reason, the only person who did build a pyramid at Isola Sacra, behind this tree here, built it at about this scale. Right? I tried to match it more or less, right? So it really is something where a lot of exceptions don't exist. Moving on to another aspect, commemoration happens. How are people commemorated? Through images and words, let's say, at the risk of oversimplifying it. Iconography, I'll give you an example on the left where somebody was in the burial niche, commemorated through an image, probably of himself, with the tools of an architect. So this is also known as the tomb of the architect because of that. And typically archaeologists look at mythological subjects because we can interpret them and relate them to themes of the afterlife. But the images that we find in Roman tombs are really all over the place, from personal depictions to mythological scenes to something that doesn't have any apparent meaning, at least for not that we can grasp it. Funerary inscriptions, I give you an example on the right of a cinerary urn that was also found in a tomb on the Via Appia, I think in 1822, and is now in the British Museum, and has a nice inscription on it. Inscriptions can be a little bit more concrete, but it's also tricky to read tombstones or funerary inscriptions like this one. We do not learn a lot from them, and then sometimes we learn surprisingly more than we think. Here, to just read this, it's an inscription that reads, "Dies manibus," to the spirits of the deceased, and then we find a Lucius Clodius Polytimus. He's the one who's buried here. He has 3 names, so he's a Roman citizen. Roman citizens have 3 names. And he's a patrono optimo. He is the ideal patron. And he's also BM, benemerenti. He's well-deserving. That's what we learn about him. And then we learn about another person, Persicus. It just says F, fake it. So Persicus made this probably for his former slave owner because he's also a libertus. He's a freed slave. So we learn a little bit about the people that were involved in making and setting up this urn. Not a whole lot, right? The person that I actually find more interesting in the inscription is the one who we seemingly learn less about, namely Persicus. because he acts in a rather strange way. He's a libertus, which means he's a Roman citizen, which means he should have 3 names, but he only gives us 1. Really, his full name should be Lucius Clodius Persicus, but he only calls himself Persicus. Why is that? Well, it's a little bit hypothetical, but it could be that he was freed fairly recently, maybe, and that just being referred to by his single name is the most normal way to refer to him. In fact, he may have been freed in his patron's will. That was something that, when his patron died, and that was something that was rather common. And maybe he even set up the urn while his patron was still alive and added the little libertus here later on after his patron had actually died and freed him. I don't know. This is just a hypothetical scenario, right? But the point is that a name may kind of hold some hints that at least make you wonder about who a person is. And sometimes you can even answer these questions. And so we can learn more from inscriptions than might be readily apparent. There is kind of a chronological development here as well. So I'll give you a little timeline. I think that commemoration gets more personal over time, to put it very simplistically. So here we have a tomb sort of from the 1st century BCE on the Esquiline once again. And you see that most inscriptions and images, there's images of shields here and various inscriptions, they're on the outside of the tomb. And they really only record one person, the pater familias, a Publius Quinctius, and I forget what the 3rd name is, I can't read it right there. But the point is, not everybody in that tomb got commemoration by name. They're only kind of commemorated as a group, as a family, as a household, through the name of the head of that household. Right? That actually continued. Right? These kinds of inscriptions you still see in Isola Sacra later on, but a new kind of inscription comes up right around the end of the 1st century BCE or CE. An inscription that was used on the inside of tomb and now records every single tomb occupant. Not every single maybe, but at least ideally everybody can be recorded. Here we have a Scirtus Cornelianus, so probably a former slave over Cornelia, who also gives us his profession. He is a symphoniacus, a musician, and probably his favorite instrument right there, right? So an image and a word now is attached to like an individual identity. And that individual identity over time gets even more detailed. So if you fast forward again 100 years, commemorations look like this. Here we have a funerary altar, which is now at Palazzo Massimo, of a young woman, girl. She's 14 years old. She even is commemorated now with a portrait, which is something relatively new at this point. And the inscription is very detailed, tells us her name, the name of her husband, the age at which she died, to the hour or day, to the day. Sometimes they even give the exact hour of the hour, number of hours somebody lived. And finally, her father, who calls strangely himself very pious instead of his daughter. Should have been the other way around. But the point is, it gets sort of a little bit more personal, and the amount of detail about people is increasing. And this may seem to contradict what I said before about types, right? I said that types get more standardized over time. Commemoration gets more personalized over time. It might sort of be something that you think, well, how do these two fit together? Shouldn't it be either one or the other? That it's either sort of more detailed and personal or more standardized. But I think it's not necessarily contradictory, maybe counterintuitive, but not contradictory, because a similar thing has actually been observed about sculpture at this time. There's a recent book that some of you may be familiar with by Jennifer Trimble, about women and visual replication in Roman Imperial art. So she looks at a certain sculptural type, the large Herculaneum woman, which is often very personalized through portraits, right? So it's individualized, but the statue always looks the same. The body type is always the same. So it's an individual commemoration in very standardized terms, right? And so I think it's possible to sort of combine these two chronological developments. When we get to my other two aspects, which I'm going to treat as fast as I can, long here, topography and ritual, no real pattern emerges. Here's a map of the Via Appia. The tombs line the street, and they keep going outward, right? until we hit the next city and beyond, right? This map just keeps going. And you have the impression that the tombs are kind of all lined up along the street here. It almost looks like this is maybe another imperial aspect of Rome, that it makes kind of a claim on the landscape in a way, right? It also creates some questions on how practical is a tomb really that's 13 miles from the city? Can you really go there on a daily basis? Here we have arrived at the next city, Bovillae, right? 13 miles out. The impression that this creates might be misleading, because tombs were often located on streets. Here we once again have the Pyramida, which is on a street that came through this gate, and the Via Ostiensis, which went down here. So once again at the intersection of a street, but there's a wall that surrounds it. May look small here, but if you go on the ground, it's at least 4 courses high, which I was surprised to learn. So this is at least 9 feet high, perhaps even higher. So it's actually also separated from the street. And more often you find these cemeteries that might be near a major street, but the tombs are not located on the street anymore. Or even something like this, a tomb that is located far away from the street and has nothing to do with it. It's in a very isolated position in a garden, actually, or in a villa or something like this. There's no chronological development that I can discern here. Maybe I'll discover it. So I'm thinking here it might be better to sort of maybe engage in a microhistory, look at individual cases. Going back to the tomb of the Shtetl that I mentioned before. This is the city. If you leave the city and take this street, you get to the tomb right here. But you have to pass the gardens, the horti of the same family that owned all the slaves that are buried in the tomb. Is it a coincidence that they're right next to each other? I'm not sure, but I could imagine that both gardens and tomb were important symbols of identity. They kind of work together. In a way, this shows to me that 2 functional elements, a garden and a tomb, kind of maybe, it's a little bit hypothetical, but maybe kind of have the same function of serving as a family symbol of sorts. If you go inside the tomb, this is definitely sure. It's destroyed, so I'll give you my hypothetical reconstruction of various inscriptions underneath virtual niches here. But what you see when you look at this, these inscriptions, without even reading them, is Shtetl, 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 Shtetl. They all have the same name. It's a celebration of something they have in common, and it's, I would say, something that articulates a collective identity. And I find it interesting that the garden that may have kind of had the same function and maybe have even been the place where some of the people in the tomb had worked is right next to the tomb and was experienced by people as they go out to bury somebody in the tomb or commemorate somebody or put roses there on the rosalia or something like this. The last aspect that I want to treat briefly is ritual and use, which is also something that changes over time. But it's important to consider how tombs were used because that really connects them to the people that they were important to. Important aspects for use is maybe the capacity of a tomb, because that gives us an idea of the group that used it. Tomb monuments in Rome range between, theoretically, a single occupancy to over 1,000, but there are certain groups. So there are certain clusters. Tombs for a few people were maybe used by a family, for a few dozen, maybe by a complete household, a few hundred, maybe by an association that sometimes owned tombs. But there's also built-in features sometimes for rituals. Things like triclinia for dinners. Here with 2 lovely dinner guests already arrived at Isola Sacra, right? That shows that a tomb was kind of a place for an encounter, where, in other words, a group comes together, a group that was bereaved or a family or a household that belongs together to enact, in a way, their unity or their disunity. I can share this picture, by the way, if you want it. Or their disunity, because you could also get a very good spot in a triclinium or a very bad spot. Something like this, an installation like this, can be used to both highlight the unity and the hierarchy, let's say, within a group. Here's a podium inscription that has a little libation hole in it, right? So maybe if you look at it from the side, that's the same inscription right there. That might be a little bit clearer. So this is something where you kind of pour libation in to commemorate somebody, but it's also maybe something that people did together and a ritual that once again connected people. The use of the use of tombs changed over time as well. Here, for example, people didn't think that a niche was important enough or nice enough for them, and what's missing there is some sort of inscription, something like this, right? It's not the exact one, but put something like that on. Here's something that's I can't get into anymore because it would take me too long. Here, a cremation tomb is adapted for inhumation use. As you might know, there's a big switch from cremation to inhumation in Roman history, which is one of the big kind of questions that I will have to grapple with and have some thoughts on, but it's such a hornet's nest that I'm not going to even touch on it now. But rather, I want to offer some final thoughts on a funerary landscape, contemplating our image there again that I started with. You will undoubtedly have noticed that I talked still a lot about monuments today. Right? I think that might be necessary because that's where a lot of our evidence is, especially in Rome, when it's not so easy to start a new excavation or to come across new evidence, right? But where you have to use some of the old excavations and publications that I showed you in my lecture today, that's where a lot of the evidence after all comes from. So it's a choice that's forced maybe on me, on people who deal with Roman tombs today, or tombs in Rome today, by previous generations of scholars. But it also, it strikes me as important too to focus on monuments because they were clearly important also to Romans. But in what sense can we then talk about a landscape? And this is something that I can really sort of just offer some general thoughts on because I haven't made much advance on this topic yet, but it's something where I wonder if this year while I'm here I can push the envelope on this. At this point, just ask questions that I cannot answer. Perhaps funerary landscape is not even a good term because it suggests that the funerary landscape is separate from other kinds of landscape, right? Which I think it isn't. I think it's part of just the Roman landscape, which is a contradictory landscape. It has lots of different types of tombs, as I showed today, lots of different functional spaces, gardens, villas, tombs, and other types of things. It has kind of a tradition that emerges and ambitious people who don't stick to that tradition but suddenly build a pyramid or something like this, right? So there's lots of contradictions that go on in this landscape. But there's also trends in it that are kind of logical, like the emergence of a Roman architectural language for tombs, for example, or changes in how people were commemorated. The landscape also kind of reflects social realities. We can clearly see hierarchies. It's very easy to see in Roman tombs who is important and who is not. But then we have also seen cases where we can maybe grasp people trying to kind of appropriate the landscape for their own purposes, like somebody using an inscription to maybe affect the way in which his or her identity is commemorated or how they deal with bereavement. So in the end, we tend to think maybe of, especially in Rome, where tombs are really on the outskirts of the city, as the suburb of the city, of the periphery as something that's marginal, right? And that is maybe what I want to counterbalance this year, because the more I think about it, I see the kind of the tombs, the funerary culture, the suburb really as a whole, as a functional space, to be really connected to the city more than separated from it, right? And so I wouldn't, I'm trying to resist maybe, is what I'm trying to say, a notion that the periphery is kind of passive, that the city is where the action is, the city is the active place. The periphery is just sort of a service sector where people go to bury and then, or do other things that they need to do, and then return to the city, which is the center. In some ways, of course, it is, but I actually think what I'm trying to get at is to see how the funerary landscape around Rome is actually connected to the city. So this might be as good a conclusion as I can reach at this point. And so I thank you and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Questions already?
Yes.
Good. I like this. Is really interesting.
Thank you.
I really like the tour through time, the changes. I guess the question I have is about change.
Yeah.
And I can start with, I think it's called the Eustachius tomb, the baker.
Yeah, the baker's Eureka.
Yeah, thank you. And you talk about the change from that unique and grand tomb into, say, and then you bring to the homogeneous ostia tombs.
Right.
And it's not your reason. You mentioned a reason given is because it's more is grounded in like psychology. There's shit from Republic to Imperial. A good comparison, I think, maybe is earlier ship from Tumulus, you trust into Adada. But the reason given for that would be much more based on economy.
Sure, yeah.
Rise of the middle class. We're talking about the meaning of tombs, the choice of tombs.
Yeah.
At what point do we need to talk about the socioeconomic status of the people buried in them? And how are you going to approach who these people are and what their meanings, what they had, and what, how that limited or influenced their choices?
Sure, yeah. And so the question is, as I understand it, is what explanations do we give for the changes, and how much do we take into account who was buried there and their status, right, and their standing, right? And okay, so let me answer the first question first. The reasons that we give to these developments are always tricky, right? And I realize this. And I would rather say once a new type is there in this case, that's when we know it probably meant something to people. Whether that is also the reason that it was invented, whatever that means, right, is a whole different question, right? And I'm not sure if we're ever going to get an answer about that. How do we know, or how do we take into account the status, the background of the people that were buried in these tombs? First and foremost, I'd say we take what they tell us, right? And that's why I've showed you inscriptions. Of course, we also have less formal writing, like graffiti, for example, and things like this for many tombs in Rome as well. What it comes down to me, because this doesn't cover everybody, of course, right? What it comes down to me methodologically, the easiest way to approach it, I think, is to think of a tomb as having a community, because that's what we can get at in most cases, right? You can get at it even if only through the number of burials that we have in one, right? And in some cases you can be very much more specific about it. So, because if you think about a tomb that was used by a community, that also is when sort of human interaction, why a tomb might have mattered to a group of people, how they actually have used it, matches the material record, right? So that would be sort of the strategy that I would use to connect people to material remains. I'm not sure if that exactly is going towards your question, but that at least is sort of a method that strikes me as useful. Yeah, Enrico.
That you guys have come across, and if so, when did they start, or did they come in and out of existence?
Yeah, there's various regulations, not about the style maybe, right, but about, for example, the location of tombs, right? There's the Tabula Heracleensis that is basically a law that stipulates that tombs have to be outside the city. Doesn't apply to Rome, to a different city, but anyway, so we know that's where tombs are. There's also sumptuary laws that we know of that kind of limit not necessarily the monument, but how many mourners you have at your funeral and stuff like this, right? So there was a certain cap, maybe, and certainly building a big tomb was sometimes seen, at least by certain ancient aristocratic writers, as something that you just don't do because it's not good style, let's say, right? But there was another part of your question. What was the last part? Which escapes me now, but yeah.
Maybe how tightly this stuff was regulated throughout your time span, or throughout your field's knowledge of the regulations.
Yeah, well, so so if you're asking about sort of a kind of a history of this once again, to my knowledge, it's kind of hard to tell because different laws apply to different time periods, and sometimes we don't know, actually. Sometimes we only have a late antique summary of a law or something like this, right? And so it's hard to kind of, at least for me, I'm not a legal historian, right, to come up with a timeline on this. But maybe another interesting aspect is kind of a hint about regulations behind tomb construction is the size, actually, of tombs, because they tend to be occupy certain plot sizes. If you calculate the measurements of tombs in Roman feet, and actually this is also on inscription, they tend to be like 10 feet wide, 24 feet wide, something like this, right? So they tend to occupy standard plots. Who knows how that came about? Maybe that was just a standard plot you bought, or this is how sort of the landscape was parceled out and sold out to individual investors or something like this, right? So there clearly was a regulation, and I've tried to give you some of the details, right? But beyond that, I'm not sure to how much detail we can get. Yeah.
I find it fascinating the relationship of the urban condition and burial site. Just wonder how it works with public health. Right? Is there a relationship of section or distance to the city, to where people
Sure.
live, other programs, and also
Yeah.
maybe the typology related to structural system that relates to how deep you are buried. Right?
Yeah.
So if you're going down, then I understand there's arches, kind of the structural system versus other typologies.
So the question is how kind of the connection between city and funerary landscape relates to public health, right? And yeah, so I mean, there's speculation that the regulation that you can't bury inside the city had exactly that reason, right? And I know of at least one inscription found on the Esquiline that specifies that bodies and other excrements have to be carried beyond this point, right? So they had to be far away from the city. I don't exactly know where it was found, but it was some distance from the city, right? So I can't give you a number. So there certainly were public health concerns. Cemeteries were also often regarded as kind of places where that are kind of dangerous or something like this, right? Not just in terms of health, but in terms of you might, encounter somebody who robs you there or something like this. And the people who work there, they were professionals, right? Grave diggers, if you will, right? Were kind of social outcasts. They were also charged with executing people, right? And torturing slaves and things like this, right? So there's something certainly about cemeteries that is dangerous, and that might be connected to that sort of concern about public health, I think. But in terms of, I've mostly talked about monuments, right? And so a monument in and of itself removes the burial in a way from the street, right? And contains it. It's kind of sealed, if you will, right? Many of the tombs I talked about were cremation tombs. So their cremation also kind of sterilizes the whole process anyway. And then just a few bone fragments are stored inside an urn, and in many cases there's an inscription on top, and the only thing you can do is pour your libation inside, and nobody ever touches this anymore, right? In other cases it's actually possible to take the lid off and look inside. But also with inhumation burials, they go into a sarcophagus or underneath the floor of the tomb, and they're sealed, right? So there is, I guess, structural precautions as well that are taken that ensure that burials stay where they are, I guess, and don't contaminate. Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating talk. Do we see any reflections of imperial tombs in Roman tombs more generally?
Okay, do we see any reflections of tombs that were built by emperors in Roman tombs? Well, certainly, right? Let's start with the first one, which is a tumulus. And I think I showed you a tumulus before. That was not imperial. If we go back a little bit, it was somewhere in my talk. I think it's maybe, no. It's up there. Yeah, this is, isn't that it?
You had it slightly before.
Yeah, no, but it's not the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for a different one. Maybe I don't have it. I know it's here, but that's a different type of tumulus. I don't know. Maybe I took it out. There's a tumulus by Lucilius Paeto at the Via Salaria. It looks exactly like, not exactly, but it looks very similar to the mausoleum of Augustus, and it probably postdates it just by a little bit. And it was made, the details escape me, but I think Lucilius Paetus was like an officer in the Augustan household or something like this, right? So there was a connection of him to the imperial house, right? So people outright copy imperial tombs, and tombs really become very, very popular right after Augustus builds one, right? So certainly there's imitations, and this inspiration is taken up by others, right? And even, the second imperial tomb that still exists, the Mausoleum of Hadrian, takes it up again, right? So yes, I think there is a certain sort of copying of what the elite does, but it's not the only trend I see. Inspirations also come from elsewhere and from more unexpected places. Leon?
I wanted to just ask more about your use of the term landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if somebody was going to
lots of pictures in the talk, right, of later periods in which these spaces are experienced and depicted, whether in these engravings or in the photos you took on the bike ride, as a kind of landscape that is experienced as a kind of certain kind of park-like experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so one part of them we wonder how much you think that can be usefully, that kind of reception rubric can be usefully used to get back to the question of experience in antiquity, and precisely to suggesting an idea of people living among these tombs, or this being a lived-in space. So that would be one branch of the question. Yeah. And the other would be, which I just thought of when Raquel was asking about public health, to what degree one could think of the Hortum Myconatus as a funerary landscape, so a place which is a potter's field that is filled in, that presumably has, for public health reasons and sort of civic hygiene, has sort of no signs potentially of being a funerary space, but is turned into a public park that is a space that's made possible public park because of its association with death. So that fits into that landscape path into your interest.
Yeah, you're right. So the first question was, how much can we actually use sort of modern and early modern reconstruction of tombs in landscapes to inspire kind of a reconstruction of an ancient funerary landscape? Probably not at all, because they represent the modern or early modern landscape, right? But I think, we can't use that as evidence, obviously, right? But we can use it to inspire it, I think, right? And so that's why I showed you this image here, because thinking of tombs in a landscape is, I think, kind of natural. And that's also, though, why it's hard to reconstruct the landscape. And that's why I think individual cases are the way to go, where we can make some connections that's meaningful, right? I specifically didn't bring up, regarding the second question, the potter's fields, because it's kind of a contentious example, actually, because we do know about these potter's fields that were kind of terrible cemeteries in terrible conditions, and were then by a friend of Augustus kind of made into a park, right? And people even think that they have found the ancient mass graves there, but precisely that is now being contested, actually, in the latest research on this, where, in the latest book that I've read on it anyway, Emma Jane Graham thinks that we don't really have any evidence for this, and this is really something completely different, right? So it might be that this is just a kind of literary image or literary exaggeration of the situation that brings out precisely sort of the dangerous place that a cemetery can be, and celebrates in a way the Augustan transformation of the city, right? That makes it into a livable place again, right? But yeah, that's usually the typical image that you would think of. You're absolutely right.
Thinking in the terms of landscape, this image is a good one. When I think of tombs, I also think of arches.
Yeah.
I think of the roads leading of tombs were outside of the city. But as you said, to what extent did gates and points of entry and points of transition play into a funerary landscape?
Yeah. Well, so tombs were near streets, so they were also near gates, depending on how far they were from the city. In this image here, the walls that you actually see in the background are later than the tombs here. So these tombs are actually outside of the city. We're looking from sort of the Circus Maximus outward here, right? And but some of the earliest tombs were right next to gates. The gate that was on this particular street, the Via Appia, would be the Porta Capena, and there was one of these aristocratic tombs right outside of it. Even though we don't have it anymore, we know it was there. And if you go to some other cities, usually what you have is that they start at the gate, which is the most public place if you leave the city, I guess, right? And then kind of line up along the road. That's what happens in Ostia, for example, right? So gates are an important point insofar as they are a significant point on the road where tombs are lined up, yeah.
Did the gates ever have any sort of acknowledgement of that relationship, if you know?
What do you mean with acknowledgement?
Would they have like inscriptions, or was there a sense of transition that you were entering the city of the dead, for example, or were you entering a place outside the city?
I don't know. That's a great question, but I think that this is something that you could search for. Maybe I might, if there's references to on funerary inscriptions to gates. Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me. Yeah, that it's some sort of transition. Have you ever thought about that, Megan?
Well, I think
Or-
at this point,
Oh,
we might
okay.
invite people to take the
Okay.
conversation upstairs, because
Sure.
I think several people have observations about this particular question or other things. I know that tombs and things about this sort are popular amongst this particular group, but they're more than the rest of society. So anyway, with that, I'd like to thank Dorian very much for this enlightening talk. Really a lot to think about, and let's continue upstairs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.